Zhao Xian had always believed he was meant for something more. But life had other plans, and those plans involved him dealing with power grids and faulty transformers in a rundown power station at the edge of a small town. He was an electrical engineer, not a hero. There was a certain irony in that. His job was all about keeping the lights on for people who didn't even notice when the lights flickered. Zhao was the kind of guy who made sure people's refrigerators hummed and their televisions blinked to life at night. He didn't dream of saving the world, just of fixing a few circuits and escaping the monotony of his humdrum existence, but everything changed one stormy afternoon. It was one of those days when the weather made no sense, boiling clouds pushing the sun to hide behind a thick veil, gusts of wind slapping at the metal exterior of the power station like a child testing the durability of their toys. Zhao had been walking the length of the transformer line, checking for faults that might have occurred during the first round of lightning strikes. He had no idea that the next bolt would be his. A crack of thunder split the air, and before Zhao could even react, the ground beneath him trembled. A flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, slammed into the transformer. The electricity surged violently through the metal structure, ricocheting off the wires, and then, in an unimaginable moment, it connected with Zhao Xian. The world around him vanished, replaced by 1,000 volts of pure electric energy coursing through his veins. His body seized, his muscles locking in a violent spasm, and for an instant, he thought he was dead. But then, something strange happened. Instead of his heart stopping or his body being reduced to ashes, he felt alive, more alive than he had ever been. It was as if his very cells were humming with the rhythm of the electrical current, his mind sharp and clear. The storm that had moments ago threatened to destroy him now felt like something he could control. Zhao's first reaction was to scream, but all that escaped his lips was a sharp, crackling sound, as if the storm itself had taken control of his voice. His hand twitched, and with an almost reflexive motion, he reached out for the nearest electrical panel, expecting nothing to happen. But then, the impossible occurred. The wires sparked as his fingers brushed against them, but instead of being electrocuted, Zhao felt the pulse of energy flow into him, not as a threat, but as something he could command. He instinctively pushed his palm toward a nearby generator, and the current arced from the panel, surging into the machine with a violent intensity. Zhao, still standing, now felt the hum of power in his bones. He was in control. When the storm cleared and the town around him returned to its quiet, rainy normal, Zhao stood in the middle of the power station, breathless and alive, his heart racing not from fear, but from the realization that something had changed forever. "How do you feel?" The voice that broke through the silence of the storm's aftermath didn't belong to anyone Zhao knew. It was smooth, confident, and had an edge of authority. Zhao turned to see a man in a dark trench coat standing just inside the station's gates, as if he had appeared from thin air. The man had an inscrutable expression on his face, his sharp eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Zhao, still reeling from the shock, barely registered the stranger's presence. He was too focused on the power he now felt thrumming through his body. "Who are you?" he stammered, the words coming out more ragged than he had intended. The man smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My name is Li Wei," he said, his voice smooth, measured. "I'm here because of your abilities." "Abilities?" Zhao asked, trying to shake off the dizziness that was starting to clear. He was still coming to grips with what had just happened. The surge of energy, the sensation of power flooding his body, he could still feel it, like a second heartbeat. "Yes," Li Wei nodded. "You've been chosen. Not many people are lucky enough to survive a lightning strike, and fewer still have the fortune to be able to wield it as you now can." Zhao narrowed his eyes. "You're saying I can control electricity?" He had always thought of himself as a pragmatic man, rooted in logic, numbers, and the dull reality of circuits and wires. This, whatever it was, wasn't supposed to be real. Li Wei stepped forward, pulling out a sleek black device from his jacket. It buzzed and whirred as he held it in his hand. "You are far more than a simple engineer now. You have the power to manipulate electrical currents, whether it's to protect yourself or destroy your enemies. His eyes locked onto Zhao's, a gleam of something cold there. And we can teach you to control it, to use it for a much greater purpose. Zhao stared at him, his mind spinning. Greater purpose? The storm outside had subsided, but his thoughts were still turbulent, his head spinning with the realization that his life would never be the same again. Li Wei smiled, his expression unreadable. I work for an organization known as the current Herald. Our mission is simple: to maintain global stability, to keep the flow of energy under control. Zhao's mind reeled at the words. He had never been interested in global politics or grand schemes. But the thought of being a part of something bigger, something powerful, was tempting. He had always felt small, like a cog in a machine that he could never quite grasp. Now, he had the chance to be more than just an engineer. He had the chance to change the world. What do you want from me? Zhao asked, his voice hoarse. Li Wei took a step closer, his face serious now. Your powers have the potential to influence the very fabric of the world. You can affect economies, control information, protect nations, or bring them to their knees. We can teach you to harness this power for the greater good. His voice dropped to a near whisper. We can show you how to control the currents of the world itself. Zhao felt a chill run down his spine, but it was hard to ignore the pull of the offer. For the first time, he could feel the sense of purpose he'd always lacked. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but the idea of being part of something greater, something secretive and powerful, ignited a sense of possibility inside him. I'm in, Zhao said, not fully understanding what he was committing to, but certain that whatever it was better than the life he had left behind. Li Wei nodded approvingly. Good. You'll begin your training immediately. Welcome to the current Herald. Zhao Xian's training within the current Herald began immediately, though the true nature of his powers and the organization's goals were far from clear. He was guided through a series of rigorous exercises designed to expand his control over the electric currents that now ran through his body. The training facility, hidden deep within an underground complex, was a high-tech marvel, full of buzzing screens, humming machines, and an atmosphere that was both clinical and ominous. For the first few days, Zhao was a passive participant, following the instructions without fully understanding the implications. He learned how to summon lightning at will, focusing his energy into carefully controlled pulses that could light up a room or obliterate a target. He was trained to manipulate electrical systems, to turn a simple circuit into a weapon, to create fields of energy that could shield him from attacks or incapacitate others. At first, the power was intoxicating. He reveled in the newfound strength and control, believing he was doing something important, something that would benefit the world. Li Wei, who had become his primary mentor, was patient, teaching him the intricacies of channeling energy and controlling its flow. Yet there was something unsettling in his manner. He spoke often of the greater good, of maintaining balance and order, but his words were always vague, and the weight of responsibility in his eyes made Zhao uneasy. The man's confidence bordered on arrogance, as though he viewed his control over the world's energy systems as a natural extension of his own superiority. During one of their training sessions, Li Wei had Zhao stand in the center of a large, metal-lined room, a place designed to focus and amplify the electrical energy they were about to harness. Zhao was to perform a series of tests, manipulating small circuits and conducting electrical arcs through the room's systems. He had mastered the basics of these techniques, but today's task was different. He was to channel an entire power grid into a continuous arc of energy. Focus, Zhao, Li Wei's voice echoed through the dim room. This is not just about power. It is about control. You must make the current obey you, not the other way around. Zhao nodded, feeling the familiar hum of energy vibrating beneath his skin. He took a deep breath, reaching out with his mind as his hand hovered above the central control panel. Slowly, he began to concentrate, willing the electricity to flow from his fingertips. At first, it was just a spark, barely visible. Then, as he concentrated harder, a surge of energy exploded from his hand, arcing across the room in a blinding flash. The electricity surged through the systems, lighting up the entire complex in a sudden, overwhelming burst. Zhao felt the familiar thrill of controlling it, the rush of power pulsing through him, but then something happened. The current began to stray, splitting off from the lines he had mapped in his mind. It danced unpredictably, bouncing off walls, careening dangerously toward the electrical panels. Zhao's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't supposed to happen. He quickly tried to redirect the energy, but the surge was too wild, too volatile. Li Wei, standing across the room, watched with a cool, almost detached gaze. Zhao's panic was visible in his expression, his brow furrowing in frustration. The electricity started to move faster, as though it had a mind of its own, and for a moment, Zhao wondered if he had lost control entirely. But just as the situation seemed like it would spiral out of control, Li Wei made a swift motion with his hand. The electricity stopped mid-air, frozen, suspended in space, and then it gently dissipated. Zhao staggered back, breathless, his mind racing. "Your control is still weak," Li Wei said softly. "But you're learning." He studied Zhao for a moment, then added, "There is more to this than simply manipulating the current. You must understand its nature, its flow. You must become one with it, not just a master of it." Zhao swallowed hard, still feeling the aftershocks of the intense power he had just unleashed. He had thought he understood his abilities, but now he realized that controlling electricity wasn't just about making it obey. There was a deeper connection, something beyond mere technical mastery. And it wasn't something he could simply learn in a few days. It was going to take time, patience, and perhaps something more. But as the days wore on, Zhao began to notice other oddities within the current Herald. There were subtle signs, small moments that made him question the organization's true motives. The deeper he delved into his training, the more he realized that the current Herald was not just a peacekeeping force as they had claimed. They were far more insidious, more controlling, than they let on. One evening, after a long day of training, Zhao overheard a conversation in the hallway. The voices were low, but they carried just enough for him to catch the words. "The market will be ours soon," one voice said. "We'll manipulate the stock exchange, influence the global energy supply, and everyone will bow to our will." Zhao's stomach churned. He recognized the voices as belonging to senior members of the current Herald, people who had been training him, teaching him to control the energy coursing through the world's grids. But this wasn't about peace, or stability, or any of the noble ideals Li Wei had preached. This was about power, about control. He pressed his back against the wall, barely breathing, as the conversation continued. "Everything is in place," the other voice said. "Once we control the energy flow, we control the world. We'll shape governments, economies, everything. It's just a matter of time." Zhao felt his heart race. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had believed in the idea of maintaining order, of protecting people. But this? This was something entirely different. The organization he had joined, the very people who had taught him how to wield the most powerful force in the world, were using that power to manipulate and dominate. They weren't peacekeepers, they were the ones pulling the strings, shaping the world in their own image. He walked away from the conversation, his mind spinning. He couldn't ignore what he had heard. But at the same time, he was trapped. What could he do? He had made himself indispensable to the current Herald. His powers were unmatched, his ability to control electricity unparalleled. He had no choice but to stay and continue learning, at least for now. But in the back of his mind, a nagging question remained: how long would it be before the very current that had given him his power was used to control him? Over the next few weeks, Zhao's unease deepened. He threw himself into his training, trying to ignore the creeping suspicion that the organization he had joined was not what it seemed. But the more he learned, the more he realized the depth of their manipulation. The current Herald controlled not only power grids and energy systems but also the world's financial markets. They could create crises at will, destabilizing economies, and bending entire governments to their will. The more Zhao uncovered, the more it became clear, the current Herald was not a force for good. They were using their power to control and manipulate on a global scale. The tipping point came when Zhao was given a mission that would forever change the course of his life. He was ordered to initiate a controlled blackout in one of the world's most influential cities. The purpose was simple: disrupt the local government, trigger chaos in the financial sector, and bring the city to its knees. It was a calculated move, designed to push the city into a state of disarray, allowing the current Herald to step in and restore order by taking control of its energy systems. As Zhao prepared to carry out the mission, he was hit by a wave of conflicting emotions. He knew he had the power to do it. He could cut the city's power, cripple its infrastructure, and watch the chaos unfold. He could bring everything to a halt with the flick of a switch, but as he stood in front of the control panel, ready to trigger the blackout, a voice inside him screamed that this was wrong. This wasn't about protecting the people, it was about dominating them. The current Herald wasn't trying to maintain balance. They were engineering a crisis to seize control. Zhao hesitated, his finger hovering over the button. He could feel the electricity inside him, pulsing with potential, with destructive force. But he didn't want to be the instrument of that destruction. Not anymore. The moment stretched into eternity, and then, with a sudden, decisive motion, Zhao pulled his hand away from the panel. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. It was time to make a choice. The final moments of Zhao Xian's decision would forever change him. The organization he had once believed in was nothing more than a shadow, a puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes. And Zhao Xian had become too powerful to simply follow orders anymore. He turned his back on the current Herald, determined to expose their true intentions and stop them before they could execute their grand plan. As he left the underground complex that had once been his training ground, Zhao felt the current still pulsing in his veins, a constant reminder of the power he now wielded. But he knew one thing for sure: the world didn't need a puppet master. It needed someone who could bring the power back to the people. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but Zhao was ready. He had a mission of his own now, to take back control, and to ensure that the current didn't flow in the wrong direction again. The future of the world was at stake, and Zhao Xian was prepared to fight for it. Zhao Xian's heart raced as he walked away from the control panel, leaving behind the opportunity to trigger a crisis that would have altered the course of a city, perhaps the entire nation. The weight of the choice hung heavy on him. He had defied the orders of the current Herald, an act that, at the very least, would make him a target. But the feeling that surged within him wasn't fear, it was something else, something powerful, relief. He couldn't ignore the fact that the organization, the people who had recruited him, were not what they seemed. They hadn't been about saving the world or maintaining balance, they were about taking control. They manipulated everything: the economy, the governments, the very flow of energy that powered the lives of millions. They had created a world where they could pull the strings, shaping it into a shadowy empire of their own design. And Zhao had become a part of it, at least for a time, but not anymore. With the blackout mission aborted, Zhao knew he couldn't go back to the complex, to the cold, calculated world of the current Herald. It was time to take action, to expose their manipulation before it was too late. But doing so wouldn't be easy. The current Herald's reach extended beyond power grids and financial markets. They had eyes everywhere. And Zhao's betrayal would not go unnoticed. He didn't know where to go next, but he knew he couldn't stay. He needed time to think, time to plan. The streets outside the facility were eerily quiet as he stepped into the cool night air, his mind still swirling with thoughts of what he had just done. He had walked away from the most powerful organization he had ever encountered. The consequences of his decision were still unclear, but one thing was certain: he couldn't allow them to continue their operations unchecked. Zhao's first step was to disappear. He needed to cut ties with everything that had defined his life up until that moment: his work, his mentor, and the insidious web of control that had been woven around him. He couldn't risk leading the current Herald back to his location. He had learned enough to know they would stop at nothing to neutralize anyone who threatened their plans. He took the train out of the city, heading to the countryside, where the isolation would give him the space he needed. He was just an ordinary man now, a fugitive, alone in a world that no longer seemed as simple as it once had. His powers, the electric energy that now flowed through his body, were both a blessing and a curse. They had given him the ability to control electricity, to manipulate the very forces that powered the world, but they had also drawn him into a deadly game of global control. He spent days traveling, moving from small town to small town, avoiding major cities. He had no real destination in mind, just a need to stay out of sight. Yet even in his isolation, he couldn't escape the creeping suspicion that the current Herald was already searching for him. He had heard stories, whispers in the wind, of operatives moving through the country, quietly eliminating anyone who had betrayed the organization. The fear of being hunted was constant, a gnawing presence that kept him awake at night. But even more than that, there was a deeper fear, the fear of being powerless again. The power he had gained, the ability to control the current that ran through the world, had become a part of him. It was as much a part of his body as his heartbeat. But with this power came the responsibility of using it wisely. The longer he stayed in hiding, the more he felt the weight of his inaction pressing down on him. Zhao couldn't sit by and do nothing. He had to act. But how? He needed allies, people who weren't under the control of the current Herald, people who still had the freedom to make their own choices. But how could he find such people? The organization's influence stretched far and wide, and even those who weren't directly involved with them were often unknowingly manipulated by their control over energy networks. It seemed impossible to trust anyone. Then, in one small, nondescript town in the northeast, Zhao found an answer. It wasn't much, just a newspaper article tucked away in a dusty corner of the local library, but it was enough. There were whispers of a group, a resistance of sorts, gathering in secret, working to disrupt the global power structures controlled by the current Herald. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead Zhao had. He didn't hesitate. He followed the trail, finding himself in a secluded cabin on the outskirts of a forest, miles from the nearest road. The people there were nothing like the members of the current Herald. They were ordinary citizens, scientists, activists, and former government officials, united by a single cause: to dismantle the control the current Herald had over the world's energy systems. They had been working in the shadows for years, taking down key infrastructure, leaking information to the press, and gathering evidence of the organization's crimes. Zhao approached them cautiously, revealing only what he thought they needed to know. He was no longer the eager recruit of the current Herald. He was someone who had seen the truth and was ready to fight for a different future. He was no longer afraid of his powers, but he had learned how dangerous they could be when in the wrong hands. Over the next few weeks, Zhao worked alongside the resistance. He used his abilities to infiltrate power stations, disable tracking systems, and sabotage the current Herald's operations. The more he worked with the group, the more he realized how deep the organization's roots went. The current Herald was everywhere, embedded in governments, corporations, and even in the systems that controlled the flow of energy across the globe. Zhao began to see a glimmer of hope. The resistance wasn't large, but it was growing. And they were not alone. Zhao had made contact with other factions around the world, groups who had seen the same signs of manipulation and control that he had. They were united by a common goal: to expose the current Herald's true intentions and free the world from their grip. But even as Zhao fought alongside the resistance, he knew that the hardest part was still to come. The current Herald was powerful, and they would not give up without a fight. Zhao had already felt the force of their wrath once. It would only be a matter of time before they came for him again, and this time, they would be ready. But Zhao wasn't afraid anymore. He had spent too long being afraid of his own power, too long hiding from the truth. The current Herald had manipulated the flow of energy for too long. It was time to return the power to the people, to stop the puppet masters and let the world decide its own future. The final confrontation was inevitable, and Zhao knew that his powers would play a pivotal role in the coming battle. But he also knew that the battle was not just about electricity, about controlling the current. It was about control itself. It was about freedom, choice, and the right to determine the course of one's own life. The storm that had once given Zhao his powers and now felt like a distant memory. What mattered now wasn't how he had gained his abilities, but how he would use them to change the world. The time for hiding was over. It was time to make a stand.